My daughter and I went without groceries for 2 weeks just to be able to afford a single gift for the family Christmas exchange. She wrapped it herself with tape she'd kept aside from her school supplies, and she carried it into my sister's living room like it was fragile enough to shatter. Her hands trembled as she set it down beneath the tree. My sister picked it up, turned it over once, and announced to the entire room, "Well, this is what poverty looks like, everyone." Everyone laughed. My mother's laugh rang out louder than anyone else's. My daughter didn't cry. She didn't say a word in protest. She simply turned and left the room in silence. That night, after I put her to bed in the cramped apartment we could barely afford, I came across the first piece of paper that would eventually change everything, and it had nothing to do with a Christmas present at all. My name is Zora Whitlock. For 6 years, it had just been my daughter, Unia, and me. I want to tell you the truth about what our life was like, because I think people who've never experienced poverty picture it as something obvious, something you'd see coming from far away. It isn't like that. It's quiet. It's a coupon tucked into a wallet. It's lowering the thermostat 2 degrees and telling your daughter it's just sweater weather. It's knowing exactly which store discounts its bread on Tuesday evenings. Unia was 8 that Christmas, and she understood our finances better than a lot of adults understand their own. She never asked me for anything. That was always the hardest part for me, not that we lacked money, but that she'd already learned, at 8 years old, not to ask. Her father, Grady, had once been a decent man. We married young, and things were fine for the first few years. He worked construction, I waited tables at a diner off Route 9, and together we made it work. Then he fell from scaffolding on a job site and fractured 3 vertebrae in his back. His employer's insurance covered the surgery, barely, but not the year of recovery that followed, not the physical therapy, not the slow, painful process of learning to stand upright again. Grady didn't cope well. I don't say that out of bitterness anymore, I say it because it's simply true. The man who could no longer work became a man who couldn't stand to look at his own reflection, and eventually, a man who couldn't stand to look at us either. He left 2 years after the accident. There was no big scene. He packed a bag one afternoon while Unia was at school and told me he needed space to figure himself out. I haven't seen him since, aside from 2 birthday cards that arrived a year late. So it became Unia and me against the world. And mostly, the world just meant rent, groceries, and my double shifts at the diner, plus the weekend housekeeping job I took on at a motel outside town. Our days had a rhythm outsiders never noticed. I woke at 5 to make it to the diner by 6, drove Unia to school myself on the months we couldn't cover bus fees, and worked my second job at the motel on weekends while a neighbor watched her for a small hourly rate. By the time she was 7, Unia was packing her own lunches. Partly because she enjoyed it, but partly, I suspect, because she understood, without being told, that it saved me time I didn't have. She was a sharp kid. Her 3rd grade teacher once took me aside to tell me Unia had tested into the gifted program, and asked gently whether we had books at home. We did, not many, but after that conversation, I started taking her to the library every other Friday, and it became one of the only things in our week that cost nothing and gave her everything. My own family didn't make life any easier. There were only 2 daughters in my family, me and my younger sister, Georgette. Growing up, Georgette was the golden child in every possible sense. She did better in school, made our mother laugh more easily, and was somehow exactly the kind of daughter our mother, Adeline, wanted. I loved my sister, I want that to be clear. For a long time I loved her without complication, the way you love someone before you fully grasp how much space you actually take up in their life. Georgette married well, a man named Preston who ran a chain of boutique fitness studios across 3 counties, and by the time Unia was born, my sister was living in a house with a circular driveway and her own housekeeper. My mother moved in with them 2 years after my father died, and from then on, our family gatherings followed a very specific geography. Georgette's house was the center of gravity. Everyone else simply orbited it. I was invited to holidays, I want to say that plainly, because I know how this might sound. I was never uninvited, never erased. I was included the way you include a mismatched chair at a dinner table, present, useful for the head count, but never quite belonging. My mother had a habit of asking me questions in front of everyone that she never bothered to ask me privately. Still working at the diner, Zora? Still in that apartment on Telford Street? Always delivered with a faint smile, as if she were performing concern for an audience. I used to tell myself she meant well. I told myself that for years. The Christmas exchange had been a tradition in our family for as long as I could remember. Each year, every household drew a name, and each year, my mother made it clear that presentation mattered just as much as the gift itself. She'd comment on the wrapping paper. She'd comment on the bows. It was, I understand now, just one more small stage for her to perform on. That year, Unia drew her cousin's name, Georgette, and Preston's youngest, a boy named Holden, who already owned more toys than I'd owned in my entire childhood. I watched my daughter agonize over what to get him for nearly 2 weeks, flipping through an old toy catalog from her school book fair, circling items in pencil, then erasing them once she remembered we couldn't afford them. Money was tighter than usual that December. The motel had cut back my hours heading into the holidays, and my car needed a repair I kept postponing because I couldn't afford to put off rent. I ran the numbers more times than I'd like to admit, and the answer never changed. If we bought groceries the way we normally did, there'd be no gift at all. If we bought the gift, we'd eat differently for a couple of weeks, more rice, more eggs, less of everything else. I didn't tell Unia we were making that trade. I made that decision alone, quietly, the way you make decisions when you're the only adult in the house. We went to the store together, and she chose a model airplane kit for Holden. The kind you assemble yourself with tiny plastic pieces and a small tube of glue. It cost $18. She held it as though it were the most important object in the world, because to her, it was. She wrapped it herself at our kitchen table 2 nights before Christmas, using paper I'd saved from the previous year, carefully turned inside out so the old creases wouldn't show. She used tape from her school pencil case, since we'd run out of the regular kind. She wrote Holden's name on it in her neatest handwriting, the way her teacher had shown her, dotting the I with a tiny heart. I remember watching her from the kitchen doorway, feeling something in my chest that was equal parts pride and grief. Pride, because she cared so deeply about giving someone else something nice, grief, because I already knew how that room was going to receive it. We arrived at Georgette's house on Christmas Eve. The driveway was already lined with cars nicer than anything I'd ever owned. Inside, the tree nearly touched the ceiling, professionally decorated in gold and white, with presents stacked beneath it in matching wrapping paper Georgette ordered every year from a boutique stationery company. Unia carried her gift in with both hands. I watched her hesitate at the edge of the living room, taking in all those glossy, matching packages, before she found a spot near the back of the tree and set hers down as gently as she could, as if she were afraid it didn't quite belong there. We opened gifts an hour later, going around the room by age, youngest to oldest. When it was Holden's turn, he tore into Unia's gift eagerly enough. Kids don't notice wrapping paper the way adults do. But Georgette reached over before he'd even gotten the box fully open. She turned it over in her hands, taking in the mismatched tape, the slightly crumpled corners, the reused paper. And then she said it, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Well, this is what poverty looks like, everyone. I want you to understand what that room sounded like in the half-second afterward. It wasn't stunned silence. It was laughter. Quick, easy laughter, the kind that tells you a comment landed exactly where it was aimed. My mother laughed hardest of all. She actually wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, still chuckling, and said something about always admiring creativity born out of necessity. I looked at Unia, my 8-year-old daughter, standing in the middle of a room full of adults laughing at a gift she'd built with her own hands out of $18 and 2 weeks of skipped meals. She didn't cry. She didn't say a single word in her own defense. She simply turned around, walked past all of us, and left the room. No one stopped her. No one but me even seemed to notice she was gone. I found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the stairs outside the bathroom, knees pulled to her chest. "You okay, baby?" I asked, sitting beside her. She didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her voice was steadier than tears would have been, which unsettled me even more. "Why do they think we're funny, Mom?" I didn't have a good answer for her then. I'm not sure I have one now. I told her something about how some people mistake cruelty for humor because it makes them feel bigger than they really are, and she nodded as though she understood it better than I did. We left shortly after, making an excuse about her being tired. No one argued to keep us there. That night, back in our apartment, I tucked her into bed and sat with her until she fell asleep, which took longer than usual. When I finally went to my own room, I couldn't sleep either. I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom, and my eyes landed on an old shoebox pushed into the back of my closet, the one holding what remained of my father's paperwork. I'd meant to sort through it properly for almost 2 years, ever since I'd moved apartments and packed it away without really looking at what was inside. I kept putting it off. Some part of me, I think, wasn't ready to sit with what little of him was left in a cardboard box. But something about that night, about watching my daughter get mocked and being powerless to stop it, made me finally pull it down and open it. My father had never been wealthy, but he had never once laughed at me. He'd spent 31 years working as a machinist, and he'd had a habit of mentioning that he was setting something aside for me and Georgette whenever the subject of our futures came up, though he was never specific about what that meant. He'd also sold a small rental property he'd inherited from his own father a few years before he passed, something I only half remembered hearing about at the time, distracted as I was by Grady's accident and everything that came with it. It had never once occurred to me to ask what became of that money. Buried near the bottom of the box, beneath old photographs and a stack of expired coupons he'd apparently kept out of habit, I found a folded letter from an attorney's office I didn't recognize. It was dated almost 5 years earlier, just a few months before he died. It referenced something called a residual distribution tied to a trust established in both my name and Georgette's. I had never heard of any trust. In the 4 years since his death, not one person had ever mentioned it. I sat with that letter for a long time before finally putting it back in the box and going to bed. I told myself it was probably nothing, an old policy already settled, a formality that no longer mattered. But something about the date, and the total silence surrounding it since, sat wrong in my stomach in a way I couldn't shake. I didn't act on the letter for almost 3 weeks. Between work and Unia's school schedule, I barely had time to think, let alone chase down a 5-year-old mystery. But it kept resurfacing in quiet moments, while folding laundry, while driving home from a double shift, while watching Unia do homework at our kitchen table. Eventually, I called my father's old attorney's office, the name printed at the top of that letter. The receptionist told me the original attorney had retired, but a colleague, a woman named Tabitha Reyes, had taken over his remaining files and could speak with me. Tabitha met me on her lunch break at a coffee shop near her office, since I couldn't afford to take time off for a formal consultation. She pulled up what she could find in the firm's records and confirmed what the letter had suggested. My father had, in fact, established a trust several years before his death, meant to be split evenly between Georgette and me once he passed. Intended to help fund things like Unia's future education, and frankly, meant to give me some kind of safety net given everything that had happened with Grady. According to the firm's last records, that trust had never been formally closed. It had simply gone silent. Who would have handled the distribution? I asked her. Tabitha checked the file again. Your mother was listed as the trustee, she said. She would have been the one responsible for managing and eventually distributing the funds to both of you. I remember sitting in that coffee shop feeling like the floor had tilted slightly beneath my chair. My mother had never once mentioned a trust, not at the funeral, not in the years since, not during a single one of those holidays where she'd asked me, smiling, whether I was still working at the diner. Tabitha offered to help me look further into it, off the clock at first, largely out of what she later admitted was sheer disbelief at what she was uncovering. Over the following month, working with a forensic accountant she brought in, a clearer picture began to emerge. The trust had, in fact, been distributed, just not the way it was supposed to be. Roughly $210,000 had moved out of the trust account over the years since my father's death, funneled in increments into an account tied to Georgette and Preston's fitness studio business, labeled in the trust's sparse records as administrative distributions and family support disbursements. My mother had signed off on every single transfer as trustee. My name never appeared once. Not a single dollar had ever reached me. I sat with that number for a long time. $210,000. Enough to have bought Unia school clothes without a second thought. Enough to have fixed my car the first time it broke down, not the third. Enough, quite possibly, to have kept Grady and me from falling apart the way we did, had it come at the right moment. I spent a lot of those weeks wondering how my mother must have justified it to herself, because she never saw herself as a dishonest woman. I don't think she ever thought of it as stealing. I think she convinced herself, one transfer at a time, that Georgette needed the money more, because Georgette was building something, a business, a bigger house, a life that looked from the outside like it required investment. And I was just surviving. In my mother's mind, survival didn't need funding. It was simply something I did quietly in the background while Georgette's life was the one worth investing in. I don't think she ever sat down and consciously decided to steal from me. I think she simply decided, again and again, that I didn't count as someone worth giving anything to. And the whole time, while I was skipping groceries to afford an $18 model airplane kit, my sister had been living off money that rightfully belonged to both of us equally. Tabitha was careful with me through all of it. She reminded me more than once that having a suspicion and having proof strong enough to act on were two very different things, and that we needed to be thorough before I said a word to my family. Over the following 2 months, the picture only grew more damning. The forensic accountant traced a consistent pattern. Funds moving from the trust account into the fitness studio's operating account roughly twice a year, always timed conveniently around tax season and around Georgette's studio expansions. There was one especially clear trail from the year Georgette and Preston opened their third location, a sum large enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Buried in the trust's own paperwork was an early letter my father had apparently sent my mother years before his death, one Tabitha found in the firm's archived correspondence. In it, he explicitly stated his wish that the trust be split evenly between both his daughters, without exception, and specifically noted his concern that Zora not be left behind because of her circumstances. He'd seen it coming. Even before he died, he'd worried about exactly this. Reading that letter for the first time undid something in me I'd been holding together for years. I cried in Tabitha's office in a way I hadn't let myself cry in front of anyone since Grady left. Not just because of the money, though the amount was staggering, I cried because my father had tried, in his own quiet way, to protect me from exactly this outcome, and the people closest to me had ignored his wishes for years without so much as a conversation. Tabitha eventually told me we had enough documentation to move forward formally, first with a demand letter to my mother and sister outlining the breach of trust, and if that didn't resolve things, with a civil claim through probate court. I want to be honest about how frightened I was to send that letter. Some small, exhausted part of me still hoped my mother would read it and simply apologize, that maybe there'd been some innocent misunderstanding I hadn't accounted for. I know now how naive that hope was. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday in early March. By that Thursday, my mother called me for the first time in months. She didn't ask how I was doing, or how Unia was doing in school. She asked, in a voice tighter than I'd ever heard from her, why I was trying to tear the family apart over money. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I wasn't the one who'd taken money that belonged to me and spent 7 years pretending it didn't exist. She had no response to that. She hung up shortly after, and I didn't hear from her again for nearly 3 weeks. Georgette's response came through her own attorney instead of directly from her, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking it. Her attorney's letter offered a partial settlement, a fraction of the actual amount, framed as a goodwill gesture to preserve family relationships, Tabitha and I both agreed it wasn't close to acceptable, and we filed the civil claim in probate court that same month. Word apparently traveled through the rest of the family faster than I expected. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, reached out to me directly, something she'd never done before, to say she'd long suspected something was wrong with how the trust had been handled, but had never had proof or standing to say anything. She became, unexpectedly, one of the few relatives who offered something other than judgment throughout the whole process. Other relatives weren't as kind about it. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a message accusing me of airing dirty laundry by bringing in lawyers instead of handling things as a family. Handling it as a family was exactly what had gotten Unia and me here in the first place, and I didn't respond to that message, or the two others that echoed it in the weeks that followed. In the middle of all this, Grady resurfaced, calling out of nowhere to ask if Unia was okay, since he'd heard through a mutual friend that I was going through something. It was our first real conversation in over 3 years. When I told him what had actually happened, he went quiet for a long moment and said he was sorry, plainly, without excuses. I let him start calling Unia every couple of weeks after that, not because I'd forgotten how things ended, but because she deserved the chance to decide, as she got older, what kind of relationship she wanted with her father. I kept my own expectations low and my boundaries clear, and the arrangement held up steadier than I'd expected. The case moved slowly, the way these things tend to. Probate court isn't fast, and Georgette's attorney fought every step of the way, requesting delays, disputing the accounting figures, arguing that some of the distributions had technically been loans rather than gifts, despite no loan documentation existing anywhere in the trust's records. It took the better part of a year. During that time, Georgette's fitness studio business, which had always looked far more successful from the outside than it apparently was on paper, began showing cracks. The forensic accounting used in my case became part of the public court record, and word travels quickly in a small business community. 2 of her studio locations quietly closed within 8 months of the case going public. Preston, I later learned, moved out of their house not long after that. Whether it was over the money or simply the mounting pressure, I never found out for certain, and honestly, I stopped caring either way. I sat through 2 hearings in person before the final ruling came down. The first was little more than procedural, both sides presenting their initial arguments while the judge set a schedule for discovery. The second, months later, was harder. Georgette testified for almost 40 minutes. At first, she stuck to the same language her attorney had used in the settlement letter: informal family support, distributions with implied consent, phrases clearly built to make 7 years of quiet transfers sound warm and mutual instead of what they actually were. But under cross-examination, when Tabitha pressed her on why none of it had ever been disclosed to me directly, something in her composure cracked. She said, almost sharply, that she'd always assumed I wouldn't have known what to do with that kind of money anyway. She said I'd always been the one who struggled, implying, without quite saying it outright, that struggling was a permanent condition for me rather than a circumstance, something closer to a personality trait than a run of bad luck. At one point she suggested that if I'd truly needed the money, I should have simply asked for it directly, instead of waiting years to find out about it, as if the entire point of a trust wasn't so that I'd never have to ask anyone for anything at all. I remember sitting very still while she said all of that, watching my sister explain, under oath, why the years I'd spent skipping groceries had simply never registered to her as something she was contributing to. It was the closest thing to an honest answer I ever got from her, and it told me everything I needed to know about how she'd been able to look at me across a Christmas table and hold up my daughter's gift the way she had. My mother, when it was her turn, spent most of her testimony insisting she had always intended to make things right eventually, a phrase the judge asked her to clarify twice, since nothing in the trust's records showed any actual plan to do so. I testified as well. I hadn't expected how strange it would feel to sit in a wood-paneled courtroom and describe, out loud and in detail, exactly what our life had looked like while that money sat in accounts I never knew existed. The skipped groceries, the folded coupons, the thermostat turned down 2 degrees. Tabitha had warned me the specifics would matter to the judge, that concrete detail carries more weight in these cases than general complaints of unfairness, and she was right. I watched the judge's expression shift, almost imperceptibly, somewhere around the part where I described Unia wrapping her own gift with tape from her pencil case. Unia, for her part, had questions of her own throughout that year, the kind I answered honestly, without burdening an 8-year-old with more than she needed to carry. I told her, in pieces suited to her age, that some grown-ups had made choices that weren't fair to us, that we were working to make it right, and that none of it was because of anything she'd done. She absorbed it quietly, occasionally surprising me months later with a question that told me she'd been turning it over in her mind the whole time. There was one afternoon, near the end of the process, when she asked me if I thought her grandmother and aunt were sorry. I told her honestly that I didn't know, and that it mattered less than she might think, because being sorry doesn't undo what someone chose to do while they believed no one was watching. She nodded slowly at that, the way she nods when something settles into place for her for good. The judge's ruling came almost 14 months after I'd first opened that shoebox at my kitchen desk. The court found clear evidence of a breach of fiduciary duty on my mother's part as trustee, and ordered full restitution of my share of the trust, plus interest calculated from the date of each improper distribution. It came to just over $240,000 once interest was factored in. The court also removed her as trustee of the family trust and referred her conduct to the Probate Oversight Office for further review, given the clear documentation of repeated, deliberate misdirection of funds over multiple years. Georgette was held jointly responsible for a portion of the restitution, since the funds had gone directly into accounts she controlled. Her attorney negotiated a payment structure rather than a lump sum, but the obligation was legally binding, and the court retained oversight to ensure it was honored. A few months after the ruling, Tabitha let me know that the State Probate Oversight Office had completed its own review of my mother's conduct as trustee. She was formally barred from ever serving as a fiduciary or trustee in any future family or estate matter, a detail that felt smaller on paper than it did in practice. To my mother, who had spent her whole life curating the appearance of being the responsible, capable one, it was its own quiet, lasting consequence, one no apology could undo. I didn't feel triumphant when I got the call from Tabitha telling me the ruling had come through. Mostly, I felt exhausted, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for so long that you forget what it feels like to set it down. I used part of the restitution to move Unia and me into a small house of our own. Nothing extravagant, just 3 bedrooms and a yard big enough for the dog she'd been asking for since she was 5. I set aside a significant portion for her education, exactly the way my father had intended all along. I finally got my car properly repaired instead of patched together one more time. I never went back to my mother's house for another holiday gathering. I didn't accept Georgette's one attempt at a phone call, made almost a year after the ruling, in which she reportedly wanted to move past all of it. Some bridges, once you fully understand what they were built on, aren't worth walking back across. The next December, Unia and I spent Christmas Eve in our own living room, in our own house, with a tree we'd decorated together using ornaments she'd made in art class. There was no competition over wrapping paper. There was no audience to perform for. I asked her that night if she remembered the Christmas with the model airplane. She said she did. She said she thought about it sometimes, actually, but that it didn't feel the way it used to when she thought about it now. How does it feel now? I asked her. She thought about it for a second, the way she does when she's being careful with her words. Like it happened to someone who didn't know yet that things were going to get better, she said. I still think about that answer more than I probably should. Out of the mouths of children sometimes comes the clearest truth adults spend years trying to reach. We built model airplanes together that Christmas, just the two of us, no audience, no judgment about the tape or the wrapping paper, just a mother and daughter in a home that was finally, fully ours. There's one more thing I want to mention, because it surprised me more than almost anything else in this story. Holden. Georgette's son, the boy who'd opened Unia's gift that night without any real understanding of what was happening around him, reached out to Unia himself years later, once he was old enough to have pieced together what his mother and grandmother had actually done. He was 13 by then. He sent her a message apologizing for laughing along that Christmas, even though he'd only been 6 years old at the time and hadn't understood a word of what was being said. Unia told him he had nothing to apologize for, that he'd just been a kid in a room full of adults who should have known better. They still talk sometimes, the two of them, in the careful, separate way children manage to build relationships their parents broke. There's a difference between bad luck and someone else's choice. It took me years to learn that. So tell me, if your own family had spent years choosing someone else over you, would you forgive them, or would you walk away for good?